So it's time for us to go ahead and talk about one of my most favorite phones that have ever came out, which is the Samsung Galaxy S8. Now, this phone from 2017, that year in and of itself was a formidable year for a lot of these phones out there. I mean, we had the iPhone X, we had the OnePlus of that year, we had, the Galaxy S8, we had a ton of different phones. The Google Pixel came out that year, well, Pixel 2 XL came out that year. Very solid phones, and 2017 was a great year for, devices. And the Samsung Galaxy S8 came out early that year, so it's approaching, 6 years old this year, which is crazy. Now, I wouldn't really recommend buying this phone anymore to actually use, but there are some other phones I would recommend buying, so links will be down in the description if you want to, pick up some phones I would recommend. You can get them from there, and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Samsung Galaxy S8, we had a 5.8-inch Super AMOLED display on the front of this phone. Now, it's a 1440p panel, very, very good display. This is by far one of my probably most favorite things going on with this specific device. This was a really big upgrade in my opinion, coming from the Galaxy S7, and even to this day, this phone's screen still looks very, very good. You had a little bit of a bezel on the top and bottom in that day and age, but I remember thinking to myself back in 2017, how can phones look any better than this? I truly didn't think any manufacturer could make a phone that looked any better than this thing. It made no sense to me, and I was just really happy that Samsung removed the home button on the front, coming from the Galaxy S7. So this phone pretty much used the capacitive keys and everything, and I was still thinking what could Samsung do, and they ended up making the Galaxy S9, which looked the same, but the S10, the S20, so many phones since then. And this phone, I think, was not only one of the most impactful, Samsung phones, but it was the most impactful probably phones in general of that, year at least, and probably for the last decade. So thumbs up from me for sure. On the front, you had a USB-C port that brought a cool feature called Samsung DeX. Now, Samsung DeX is like a desktop experience. This is by far one of my most favorite things that the Samsung Galaxy S8 brought. Although I don't use Samsung DeX every day, I talk about it every day though. It's a really cool feature, and I really wish more manufacturers would utilize features like this. You also had a headphone jack on this phone too, which that in and of itself is very interesting. Even at this point, a lot of phone manufacturers were moving away from the headphone jack. Apple had already done away with it, so this phone still had it, which was very interesting, and many Samsung phones after this had it too. But you also had a micro SD card slot. Now, Samsung did not go away from their, SD card slots yet, but they were pretty close. A few generations after this, the S21 ended up removing it, but that was another pretty big deal in my opinion as well. So, in my perspective, gets a thumbs up for me in the side and in the body and everything like that too. Now, you did have the glass back on this phone, which I think was pretty cool. Again, having a glass back on this phone at that moment was awesome. A lot of phones had glass backs, so not really that big of a deal there. Single camera setup on the top with a fingerprint sensor, which is pretty cool. You had wireless charging on this phone too. And overall, still to this day, this phone still feels like a very, very premium, expensive phone. And as I mentioned before, that's something where when I look at this device, I just get so happy. I feel like Samsung just did a great job with this phone at that moment. And I still think to this day and age, it still feels and looks like a very premium phone. I think the iPhone X may have held up a little bit better in the exterior, but with things like the headphone jack and the micro SD card slot in Samsung DeX, the Galaxy S8 sits in a very, very good spot where it's kind of held up very, very well with the features it had at that moment. Now, in the camera department, this is one of the probably not the most sought after feature with this phone in this day and age. It had a single 12 megapixel wide angle camera on the back, and it had kind of like a dual camera setup on the front. An 8 megapixel wide, then a 2 megapixel iris scanner kind of thing situation going on with it. Now, with the Samsung Galaxy S8, this phone, personally I think is, it's a good phone. I like this phone a lot, but the camera on the back, at least how it's aged, it really hasn't aged that great. For one, I want to say the features of this camera I think are great. You have a lot of features built in, which I've always found to be really nice. Whenever you have a lot of features like this built around a camera like this, you end up getting tons of features, and Samsung has always done a good job at giving us a bunch of features built in with their device at one moment. So that was something that I really did like about this phone. Now, I will say, to kind of add on to that, the camera quality itself, at least for the model I've had, and I've had a few Galaxy S8s, they're not really that great of quality. And I think this could be due to the camera aging. I feel like the iPhone Xs that I have held up better in the camera department than the Galaxy S8s. So that could be one thing to keep in mind as well. Again, not like a deal breaker or anything. I don't think most people are buying this phone anymore, but it is one of those things to kind of keep in mind. The front camera also is not that great. You had that, 8 megapixel camera, 1440p video. You could shoot higher resolution video on the front than the iPhone 10, but I think the iPhone 10 could do 4K 60 on the back. So, it was kind of not as great, I would say, on the back camera side. But I will say the things that have aged this camera the most, probably the single lens, as well as like no 4K 60 on the front of the back. But otherwise, I think the camera features of this thing actually made up for a lot of those situations. So in terms of that, it kind of gets a thumbs up for me as well. I would say not thumbs up, but it's definitely okay. In the software longevity side, this is where this phone completely fell on its face. I feel like this phone could have easily gotten a One UI 4, to be honest. This thing stopped at One UI 1. Now this was right before, I think the Galaxy S9 actually was right before where Samsung started to actually increase their longevity of their phones. So I will give Samsung credit now, like they are actually doing it. But this phone in particular, I feel like could have set a precedent of actually lasting longer than their predecessors and whatnot. So this phone started off with Android 7, it got Android 8, and then it ended off on Android 9. So to put that in perspective, the iPhone 10 that came out the same year as this phone ended up getting, pretty much all those iOS versions, and it's still supported to this day. I think the Android 9 update on One UI 1, I think that came out when? Like in 2018, 2019? I think 2019 was the year that, version of software came out. So since then, for like 4 years now, the iPhone 10 has still been getting software updates. So that phone is in a very good situation, the iPhone 10. The Galaxy S8, probably one of its sadder aspects. One UI 2 was a pretty big update, and I feel like the Samsung could have probably pushed that to this phone as well. They did end up changing their ways, so I have to give them some credit, but that is one thing that I'm still kind of mad about, to be honest. Now, on the performance side, this phone has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 835 chipset inside with 4GB of RAM. Now, I will say 4GB of RAM is quite a bit to have on a phone back then, and I still think in this day and age it holds up very well in that, specific situation. I do think with phones like this, iPhone 10, it can do more with less. And again, the reason why I'm bringing up the iPhone 10 so much is because it came out the same year as this one. It was kind of its main rival in a way. And I do think with the Samsung Galaxy S8, the performance of this phone is actually kind of interesting. So it does take quite a bit of time to load applications. It is a little slow here and there. Sometimes if you click on an application and open it up, it can take a little bit of time for it to actually load up. And, I will say the UI of it is smoother and faster than I could have imagined. It's definitely not a fast phone by any means, but it feels like somewhat of a faster phone, which is actually interesting. But when you have phones like the iPhone 10 that still feels so smooth, the main issue here with the Galaxy S8 is actually with mostly, in my opinion, loading speeds and loading times and everything like that. Otherwise though, if you're trying to play like big intensive games, I think we all know this phone's not really, made for that specific thing anymore. But back then, it had a pretty good chipset. It had a decent amount of RAM, and I think this phone has held up okay, but like every time I compare this phone against the latest and greatest Galaxies, it's always a much slower experience. It's always choppy, but that's what you kind of, get when a phone like this. But when this phone first came out, that wasn't quite the case. So in the performance side, it kind of gets a thumbs up for me as well. And to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll definitely tell you is, I think this phone, in my opinion, sits at a very interesting spot. It's not worth it anymore. I think most people probably know that by now. But when I look at something like the Samsung Galaxy S8, this phone brought so much to the table, and I still think it's a very interesting phone in terms of hardware. I think the software is still kind of the thing that if Samsung honestly made a Galaxy S8 and they just put the latest software version on it, maybe a newer chipset, I think a lot of people would buy it. If they sold it for $300, $250 or something, I feel like a lot of people would end up buying this phone. But I wouldn't recommend buying it anymore if you're planning on using it. It's severely outdated. It's not, I think it may be still getting a security update here and there, but it's not really worth it to buy and use anymore. If you want, I would recommend at the very least buying a Galaxy S10 or something along those lines. I don't think I would really recommend buying a Galaxy S8 anymore to use, but to, have as a collector's item or something, then by all means go for it. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comments section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.